So I was born and raised in New Jersey. My earliest memory was me crying in my crib because my parents were fighting. My dad got physically abusive with my mom. My dad was an alcoholic, and as a result, my parents divorced when I was 3 years old. I never really felt close to my biological dad because when he drank, he would have a bad temper, and I was uncomfortable being around him. My mom remarried when I was 6, and at that time we started going to the Catholic Church, and I'm thankful because it sparked a belief in God for me. Unfortunately, we stopped going to church when I was 13 years old, so I didn't think a lot about God after that. Both of my parents worked hard, so I had a lot of unsupervised free time, and in that time, I pretty much chased after boys. I had a really bad potty mouth. I cussed a lot. I also started experimenting with alcohol at the age of 10. I remember getting invited to a really nice fancy party when I was 13 years old, and I got completely drunk and made a total spectacle of myself. I threw up on myself, I passed out, and I blacked out. I continued drinking all throughout high school. In fact, I partied so much and I had a lot of parties at my house that I was voted class partier out of 300 plus students in my class. I became sexually active at the end of my senior year of high school. After high school, I decided to go to college. I had no idea what I wanted to do, but I did find out that recreation was a college major, so I figured that would be a perfect major for me because I loved to party and I was really good at it. I continued partying and messing around with guys in college. I also joined a sorority. My partying was definitely getting out of control because I was blacking out. I was driving drunk regularly. There were times when I would wake up and not even know where I parked my car. Of course, it seemed as if everybody in college was doing the same exact thing I was doing, so at the time I didn't think I had a problem. I was dealing with a heartbreak from a relationship towards the end of my college, and so after I graduated college, I moved to Florida. My very first job in Florida with my newly found college degree was at a resort making a whopping $6 an hour. So needless to say, I needed to get a second job so I could actually pay my bills. So I got a job waiting tables and bartending. So at that restaurant, I met a customer who I really liked. We had a very flirtatious relationship. But unfortunately, he wasn't wearing a wedding ring, so I had no idea he was married at the time. Once I found out he was married, I was pretty bummed, but I thought we could at least be friends. But with all of the drinking and partying, one thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was in a full-on adulterous relationship with a married man. It also turned out he had small children. This was definitely not one of my finer moments in my life. This affair lasted 2.5 years, which I always knew was completely wrong, but I really thought I loved him, and somehow I justified it to myself. During that 2.5 years, he ended up splitting up with his wife, which I completely felt responsible for. I definitely struggled with guilt and shame after that. But on the other hand, I was also hoping he wanted to have a future with me, but I learned that he wasn't interested in getting married again, which was devastating and heartbreaking to me, so we ended up breaking up. Shortly after, I jumped into a rebound relationship with a new man. We moved in together. It was not a good relationship. We fought for most of the 2 years we were dating. He ended up cheating on me, so we broke up. At this point, I was pretty sad and unfulfilled in my life, and a thought came to me, I need to find a church. I remember visiting one and liked what the pastor said, but for whatever reason never went back. So that was about the time when I started dabbling in New Age stuff. I started to see a psychic, I was messing around with horoscopes, and I was still partying a lot. Also at that time, I had a friend named Cindy Ryan who I just adored. She pursued a friendship with me. She always talked to me about the Lord, which I loved, and she was the only Christian person I knew at the time. So one night, Cindy and her friends were on a mission to get me saved. They took me out to dinner, and they pulled out all of the evangelism techniques. They also took me to a local church, and at the end of the sermon, the pastor called people up to the front to give their life to Jesus. And I remember what he was saying really resonated with me, and I wanted to go up, but I was too prideful, so I didn't. So after the church service, I left Cindy and her friends. They were probably pretty disappointed. And I drove to the beach by myself. And I basically told God, okay, God, I'm all in. I told him that I wanted to give my life to him. I didn't exactly know how to pray at that time, but I knew that my life was about to drastically change, which it did. That was January of 1999. I was 31 years old. So the next day, I knew I was different. I just knew I was different. It literally felt like God supernaturally gave me a spiritual heart transplant. The first thing I recognized was I had no desire to cuss anymore. I just stopped. God miraculously took that away from me. I had an awful potty mouth, like I said earlier. And I remember a few weeks later, I actually fell down the stairs and not one cuss word came out of my mouth. So I knew I had been delivered from cussing. Another change occurred with my belief around abortion. I had a lot of liberal views and was always pro-abortion, but the day after I got saved, I realized that abortion was wrong and I began to speak out against it. Unfortunately, because of this and the fact that everyone thought Colleen had now become religious, it caused a lot of my friends to walk away from me. Another profound change was my view on premarital sex. Literally overnight, I woke up understanding that sex outside of marriage was sin, and I knew that the next time I would have sex again would be on my wedding night, which is what God did. So when I got saved, I had no Christian friends except for Cindy. So I prayed for some because that's what Cindy told me to do, just pray for some. So the Lord answered my prayer pretty quickly. I found a new Christian friend group, and they had invited me to join in an accountability group and a prayer group. And in that group for a whole year, I learned how to pray, and I also saw God answer so many of my prayers, which helped build my faith a ton. So with all of these lifestyle changes, one more thing needed to go, and that was my reckless partying. This happened when I began volunteering at Urban Youth Impact. When I started volunteering with the teenage girls, God convicted me that I couldn't be a hypocrite anymore, and I had to give up the partying, which I did. Again, that was totally another miracle, and God was just so good to do that to me, or for me. When I started volunteering at Urban Youth Impact, I began to have discipleship and accountability in my life, and so my life began to drastically change. And the very best thing that happened to me when I began to volunteer for Urban Youth Impact was I met my awesome husband, Chris Truss. But that's another story for another time. So if you want to know more about that, you need to come check out our singles class. So in conclusion, I believe we all have a God-shaped hole in our heart. And for the first 31 years of my life, I tried to fill that hole with all kinds of things that did not satisfy. On the path that I was on, I would have continued to have broken relationships. I'm sure I would have perhaps gotten more involved with the occult or a false religion, and I definitely think I would have been an alcoholic for sure. Everything left me broken and unsatisfied and wanting more. But through my relationship with Jesus, he has filled that empty place inside of me, and he has healed my wounds, and he has changed me, and I am completely satisfied in him. If you have never said, I'm all in with you, Jesus, I would encourage you to do that today, because it was the best decision I ever made, and I've never met anyone who ever regretted surrendering their life to him.